Last year's hockey season was a truly crazy one. We as hockey fans got to witness so many incredible moments and occurrences, from the spectacular play of players like Connor McDavid, to the Boston Bruins becoming the greatest regular season team ever, and the Toronto Maple Leafs finally winning a playoff series. I was beginning to wonder if I would ever see that again. But with all the great hockey I got to witness last year, I believe that the best moment was the true Cinderella run of the 8th seeded Florida Panthers team. I mean, this run was phenomenal. First, they pulled off a historic upset over the Boston Bruins. This was the greatest regular season team ever. And after beating them in the first round, they would go on to beat the Toronto Maple Leafs and then the Carolina Hurricanes. And they were just playing some beautiful hockey, especially led by the clutch play of Matthew Tkachuk. He was making an absurd amount of good plays during the whole playoffs. And of course, the spectacular play of their netminder, Sergei Bobrovsky, who just rejuvenated his career in the playoffs. However, just like with the original Cinderella story on their Cinderella run, the clock struck 12 for them and they realized that they were overmatched in the Stanley Cup Finals. So even though they didn't end up winning the Stanley Cup, it was still an incredible run, because seeing an 8th seeded team make it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals is a very rare occurrence. But that's why I wanted to make this video, because I wanted to take a look back at the most improbable runs in NHL history. So for the purposes of this video, I wanted to take a look at the 8th seeded teams that made it at least to the conference finals. And all of these runs are truly remarkable, but I believe one of them is the single greatest run in NHL history. Before going any further, if you're new to the channel, welcome. On the channel I make different hockey videos, whether historic or more recent, so if you want to see more, please consider liking and subscribing. Totally free, only takes a second and makes a massive difference. Now let's get into the rest of the video. So other than the Panthers, which I just covered, there have been 5 other occurrences of 8th seeded teams making it to at least the conference finals since 2000. I'll save the best one for last. But the most recent example was the 2020-2021 Montreal Canadiens, which I'll admit there is a slight asterisk here, since due to the pandemic restrictions, the NHL didn't have conferences and they went to 4 divisions, so the Canadiens weren't technically an 8th seeded team. However, they were ranked last out of the 16 teams to qualify for the playoffs. So for the purposes of this video, I will consider them an 8th seeded team. So what happened? Well, during their first round matchup against the rival Toronto Maple Leafs, the Habs were down 3-1 in the series, and as most hockey fans know, if you hear the sentence that the Toronto Maple Leafs had a 3-1 playoff lead, it's probably safe to assume that they lost that series. Which in this particular case is also true. So the Canadiens were down 3-1, and then they would have 2 hard-fought back-to-back overtime wins against the Maple Leafs, tying the series 3-3, and then they would end up winning a Game 7, advancing to the next round. In the next round, they would sweep the Winnipeg Jets, and then in the next round, they would beat the Vegas Golden Knights in 6 games, making it to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time since 1993. I'll admit I'm a Montreal Canadiens fan, so it was pretty special to see them finally reach a Stanley Cup, even if it was during the pandemic. However, unfortunately, they would end up losing to the Tampa Bay Lightning, who had won the previous year and just went back-to-back. So that incredible run fell short. But what about the second most recent run by an 8th seeded team deep into the playoffs? Well, that was the 2016-2017 Nashville Predators, which was also a very improbable run, not simply for the fact that they were an 8th seeded team, but also the circumstances around the season. Because going into the season, the Predators actually traded away their longtime captain Shea Weber for another defenseman, PK Subban. I'll admit, as a Habs fan, that one hurt, because PK Subban is just beloved. But you don't usually trade away your captain if you're hoping to compete for a Stanley Cup. However, the Predators shocked the world by going on an incredible run. As an 8th seed in the first round, they would end up playing the heavy favorite Chicago Blackhawks. And they wouldn't end up just beating the Blackhawks, but they would sweep them, and they would only give up 3 goals during the whole series. Which their goaltending was a pretty key part of this whole run, because their goalie Pekka Rinne just went on one heck of a run. Next, they would beat the St. Louis Blues in 6 games, and in the conference finals, they faced the Anaheim Ducks, where they would also win in 6 games, advancing to the Stanley Cup Final versus the Pittsburgh Penguins. However, this Cinderella run by an 8th seed would also fall short, unfortunately, as the Pittsburgh Penguins would end up winning in 6 games. This was actually the second of a back-to-back championship that the Penguins won. Okay, so those 2 teams, like the Florida Panthers, made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Final, but fell short. How about the 2009-2010 Montreal Canadiens? This Canadiens team went on one heck of a run in the playoffs. They were the betting underdog in every single round, and they were able to reach the Eastern Conference Final by beating some generational players along the way. The first round saw them go against Alex Ovechkin and the President's Trophy winning Washington Capitals. It did take a grueling 7-game series, but eventually they got the job done. But in the next round they would face Sidney Crosby and the defending champs, the Pittsburgh Penguins. And just like in the first round, the Canadiens would win in a hard-fought 7-game series, mostly on the back of their goalie Yaroslav Halak, and they went on to face the Philadelphia Flyers in the Eastern Conference Final. Now the Flyers also had an incredible run. They were a 7th-seeded team. They would actually end up beating the Canadiens and head to the final where they would lose to the Chicago Blackhawks. So it was a wacky season where the 7 and 8 seeded teams in the Eastern Conference met up in the Eastern Conference Final. But I do think that's the beauty of hockey, is it's so unpredictable, especially in the playoffs, because low seeded teams can go all the way. So that was another 8th seeded team that went deep into the playoffs. They didn't reach the finals, but as I mentioned, they're just one of 6 8th seeded teams to reach the conference finals. Next, I want to look at the 2005-2006 Edmonton Oilers. Coming off of the 04-05 lockout, the NHL returned to the ice for the season, and in the first round, led by their captain Jason Smith, the Oilers beat the top team in the league, the Detroit Red Wings, in 6 games. Next, they took care of business against the San Jose Sharks in 6 games, and in the conference final, they faced the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim, where they would win the series in 5 games, advancing to the Stanley Cup Final, where in the finals they would face the Carolina Hurricanes. And this was kind of a crazy final because the Hurricanes would go up 3-1, only for the Oilers to improbably come back, force a Game 7, but they couldn't quite pull it off, and they would lose in Game 7 to the Canes, who won their first Stanley Cup. But talk about falling just short, they were just 1 game away from becoming the first 8th-seeded team to go all the way and win the Stanley Cup. So the Panthers and the other 4 teams I just covered were 5 of the 6 8th-seeded teams to go to at least the conference finals. However, they all fell short. But I saved the most improbable run for last, because I truly believe that this is the greatest underdog run in NHL history. The team I'm referring to are the 2011-2012 Los Angeles Kings. No other 8th-seeded team in professional sports has accomplished quite what this Los Angeles Kings team did. It's crazier when you realize that this run that they had was all possible after they snuck into the playoffs after winning their final game of the regular season. So they were that close to not even making the playoffs, and had they missed the playoffs, they would not have made hockey history. But unlike their mediocre regular season, their playoff run was definitely not mediocre. In the first round, they took down the President's Trophy winning Vancouver Canucks in 5 games. They followed this up by sweeping the St. Louis Blues, and in the conference finals, they eliminated the Phoenix Coyotes in just 5 games. With a 12-2 record up to that point, the Kings were red hot, and they would end up facing the New Jersey Devils in the Stanley Cup Final. Now in the finals, they actually took a 3-0 series lead against the Devils. However, things got more interesting when the Devils would win the next 2. So now the Kings had a lot of pressure going into Game 6, but they seemed to handle it well because they dominated the Devils in Game 6. They would end up winning the game 6-1, and they would capture their first ever Stanley Cup, becoming the first and still to this day only 8th-seeded team to win the Stanley Cup. A lot of this was possible due to the spectacular play of their goalie Jonathan Quick. He would end up taking home the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP. But truly a spectacular run. I believe it's the single greatest playoff run in NHL history and arguably one of the greatest in any sport. But what do you think? I know that there are other great runs that weren't 8th-seeded teams, and of course I was only covering 8th-seeded teams from 2000 onward because of the playoff format and how things have changed. But these runs were spectacular, and while only one of them ended up capturing the final trophy, the others were still incredibly impressive, and I could imagine enjoyable to watch for hockey fans. But if you like this kind of video and want to see other hockey videos, please consider liking and subscribing for more, totally free, and you can always change your mind. But thank you for watching.